My name is Rena Vale, and the only crown I ever expected to touch was the pale ring of flour that forms on your wrists after a day of kneading. In the coastal town of Greyhook, my life was measured in sacks of wheat, the cost of lamp oil, and whether my younger brother Jory remembered to latch the back door before night winds brought thieves. We ran a narrow noodle stall that leaned toward the sea breeze, a place where dockhands traded coins for warmth and sailors traded rumors for extra scallion. My parents were gone, storm and fever, 2 polite words for being swallowed by poverty, and the stall was what remained: broth, steam, and a stubborn routine that kept us from falling into the cracks of the world. The day I found the boy, winter had sharpened itself into a knife. I was carrying a bucket of brined kelp back from the harbor when I saw a shape near the dune grass, half buried in frost. At first I thought it was a seal washed inland. Then the shape moved, a tiny shiver, and the sound that escaped was a breath so thin it barely deserved the name. He looked 9 or 10, maybe older, maybe younger, the way hunger erases certainty. A torn cloak hung from his shoulders, stitched with a pattern too fine for our lanes, and his hands were cut as if he had clawed at stone. I should have walked past. Greyhook trained you to protect your own bowl. Yet the boy's ribs rose again, stubbornly, and something in me that had survived too many nights refused to leave another child on the road. I carried him home, cursing my own softness the entire way. We had no physician, only old Sable, the apothecary who sold bitter herbs and sharper opinions. He arrived with a pouch of dried leaves, and the solemn expression of a man calculating how much grief would cost. "Cold sickness," he said, pressing 2 fingers to the boy's throat, and he took a blow to the head. He named a price: 2 silver crowns for tinctures and salves, another silver crown if the fever turned. 2 crowns was more than our stall earned in a month. I opened the jar under my bed where I hid our savings, the money meant to pay Jory's school fee at the temple class. My hands shook as I counted. Winter could be endured in extra layers. A child dying on my floor would not leave. I paid, and old Sable began his work with the brisk competence of someone who refuses to feel. The boy lived. Survival, however, left him altered. When the fever broke, he blinked at my soot-dark ceiling like it was the dome of a palace. He sat up too quickly, swayed, then pointed at me with absurd authority. "You are far too loud for a lady-in-waiting," he declared, voice hoarse but righteous. Jory burst into laughter, so bright it startled even him. The boy scowled, then winced as if the motion pulled at hidden bruises. He introduced himself as Heir, starward ward of the realm, and insisted I address him as Your Grace. He inspected my chipped bowls as if evaluating court silver. He refused broth at first, suspicious of poison, until I pressed a spoon to his lips and he tasted honest salt and onion. His eyes widened with offended pleasure. "This is acceptable," he admitted, then demanded a second bowl with the grim dignity of someone granting mercy. Days passed, and Sale's certainty did not fade. He remembered no family in Greyhook, no address, no ordinary details, yet he could recite court etiquette in a voice that made it sound like scripture. He knew the names of distant rivers, the order of provincial governors, and the correct number of bells that should ring for a high council session. He also did not know how to carry a bucket without spilling half of it. When he tried to help at the stall, he held a ladle as if it might bite. I put a rag in his hands and told him to wipe tables. He obeyed with a glare sharp enough to slice seaweed. Sailors teased him, and his cheeks flared with indignation that looked almost healthy. Jory showed him how to haul water from the well and how to laugh at yourself when you failed. Sale resisted at first, then copied Jory's grin with cautious curiosity, as if joy was an unfamiliar language. One night, after closing, Sale's breath began to rattle. His chest rose too fast, then stuttered, and his fingers curled like claws around the blanket. I thought the fever had returned. Old Sable arrived and listened with his ear pressed to Sale's ribs. His face tightened. "Not fever," he muttered. "A weak heart." He explained the condition in blunt terms. Sale's pulse could fail without warning, especially under stress, and he would need expensive tonics to steady him. "He might not see 15, Sable said, not cruelly, simply as a man naming weather. Jory, wide-eyed, dug into his secret coin pouch and offered his last copper pieces for medicine, voice cracking as he said we could at least buy Sale a decent blanket if the worst happened. I snapped at him to save his coins, then sold half our winter-dried fish stock to buy the tonic anyway. I told myself I was investing in a child. The truth was uglier. I could not bear to watch a boy die twice. Greyhook had one answer to long-term poverty: marry it into someone else's household. A carpenter twice my age proposed, promising I would never lift a flour sack again. Only babies. I said no. I chose a different chain indenture because it left my hands my own, even if it stole my hours. The Marrow house on the hill hired a steward's assistant, someone to manage linens, inventories, and the quiet wars of servants. The pay was 1 silver crown each month, and the Marrow family kept a private tutor for their children. Servants' siblings could sit at the back and listen. It was not kindness. It was a way to keep labor loyal. I signed the contract, knowing it could trap me for years, and told myself that survival was a form of devotion. I moved between 2 worlds that winter, the Marrow house by day, Greyhook by night. In the mansion, I learned that wealth smells like polished wood and controlled silence. I learned to count bolts of cloth, to record the breakage of teacups, to accept blame with a neutral face when a lady's mood demanded a target. In our stall after dark, I stirred broth with aching wrists while Sael, wrapped in a second-hand coat, practiced writing characters on a slate. Jory listened during his temple lessons and came home reciting law maxims with pride. Sael scoffed at those maxims, then corrected them with sharper versions. When Jory complained that Sael acted superior, Sael replied that superiority was not an act, it was a duty. I threatened to put him back on table wiping if he kept talking like a proclamation. The threat made him glare, but it also made him laugh under his breath, a sound so rare it startled me. The spring equinox brought disaster. I returned from the Marrow house to find the stall in disarray, the broth pot cold, Jory pacing like a trapped animal. "He's gone," Jory said, voice trembling. Sael left at dawn. On the table lay a folded scrap of paper in careful handwriting. "I will not let you sell your life because of me. Do not follow." The ink was too elegant for Greyhook. My stomach turned. Sael's weak heart could not survive a long walk, and the road out of town was lined with cliffs and opportunists. Jory and I searched alleys, docks, empty sheds, the stone culvert where children dared each other to crawl. We called his name until our throats burned. By late afternoon, the sky turned the color of wet ash, and my fear began to curdle into guilt. I had demanded obedience from a boy whose mind had been burned raw, and now he had repaid me with a sacrifice he didn't understand. A carriage rolled into our lane at dusk, wheels too clean for Greyhook's mud. A man in pale robes stepped out, face smooth as porcelain, hat stiff with official embroidery. He carried a lacquered staff with a silver star at its crown, and behind him 2 guards held their hands close to their swords without touching them. The man bowed to me with exact politeness. "Mistress Vale," he said, "by order of the High Council, we thank you for sheltering the ward." The words did not fit my street. Before I could answer, he gestured, and a tray was lifted from the carriage, gold coins stamped with a star, enough to buy every stall in Greyhook. My knees went weak. "The ward's sale care," the envoy continued, "is required in the capital. The king's protectors request that you accompany him as temporary guardian, since he has spoken your name." Jory made a sound between a laugh and a sob. My mind went blank, except for one clear thought. Sael was alive, and the road had not taken him. They did not take him alone. They took all of us. Jory was swept into the carriage as companion for the ward, a title that sounded grand and meant supervised schooling. I was offered a choice that was not a choice. Accompany Sael to the capital under council protection, or remain behind with questions that could attract the wrong kind of attention from men who disliked loose ends. I climbed into the carriage with a bag of clothes and a heart full of dread. Sael sat inside, cleaned and bandaged, posture straight as if he had never slept on my floor. His eyes met mine, and for the first time his arrogance cracked with shame. "I thought I could fix it," he whispered. "I thought if I disappeared, you would be free." I swallowed hard. "Freedom isn't the absence of people," I said. "It's the absence of fear." He looked away, and the carriage rolled north toward the city I had only heard about in sailors' stories. The capital, Asterhold, rose out of the plains like a promise carved in stone. It had walls layered like cliff strata, towers capped with copper that caught sunlight and turned it into warning. Inside, streets branched into districts with invisible borders. Silk markets, scholar quarters, soldier barracks, temple courts. The palace sat at the center like a sleeping beast. White stone veined with pale blue, star motifs carved into every arch. I expected to feel awe. Instead, I felt the same thing I felt when stepping into the Marrow house. The sick awareness that wealth comes with rules you can break only once. Sael was led to an annex wing guarded by men who smiled too much. Jory was assigned to a palace tutor. I was given a plain uniform and a new title, quartermaster clerk, responsible for tracking storerooms and provisioning. It sounded small. In a place like Asterhold, small positions are where information hides. Within a week I learned why Sael mattered. The old king had died without a publicly acknowledged heir. A man named Corvin ruled as High Regent, protector of stability, and he insisted the realm could not risk a weak successor, while northern raiders tested the border. Yet Sael carried the starward mark, a faint star-shaped birthmark on his shoulder that, according to law and legend, identified the bloodline empowered to wear the crown. Corvin claimed Sael was too ill to rule and that the mark could be faked. Others whispered that Corvin feared Sael not because he was weak, but because he could become strong with the right allies. Edrin Lark, a young judge with tired eyes, visited me one afternoon and asked what I had seen of Sael's memory. He spoke softly, as if our conversation itself could be recorded. I answered carefully. "He remembers rules," I said, "but not faces." Edrin nodded as if that confirmed something painful. "Rules are harder to erase than love," he murmured. "My work with storerooms put me near the palace's veins. Food, cloth, medicine, lamp oil. All of it moved through my ledger before it moved through mouths and bodies. I noticed patterns. Grain shipments arrived lighter than they should, yet the kitchens still served feasts at Corvin's private dinners. Medical tinctures for soldiers disappeared, while Corvin's men wore glossy boots that never touched mud. When I asked questions, senior clerks smiled and advised me to focus on my station. One of them, a woman named Senna, warned me in a whisper that clerks who counted too loudly stopped counting permanently. I went quiet, then counted anyway, because I had spent my life watching people starve, while others polished their rings. The turning point arrived with a flood. The river Dyer broke its banks upstream and ruined half the spring crops. Bread prices doubled in 3 days. In the markets, women fought over barley as if it were gold. Corvin held a council session and spoke of necessary austerity. That night I traced the council's emergency ledger and found a hole where food had been siphoned into private warehouses under a merchant name that matched Corvin's cousin. I carried the evidence to Edrin in the temple archives, hands shaking. Edrin read my notes, jaw tightening. "This is treason with clean ink," he said. He asked me a single question. "Will you testify if it costs you your place?" I thought of Greyhook, of Jory offering copper coins for medicine, of Sael gasping for breath. "I'll testify," I said. Edrin's expression did not soften. "Then we must move carefully," he replied, and the carefulness in his voice felt like a cage. Corvin did not punish me openly. Open punishment creates martyrs, and Corvin hated anything that resembled moral narrative. Instead, he praised my diligence and reassigned me to outer storerooms far from council eyes. It was exile disguised as promotion. Sael, upon hearing, demanded I be returned. Corvin replied that the ward's duty was to rest, not meddle. That night, Sael snuck out of his annex and found me among stacked sacks of lentils. Moonlight made his face look younger, almost like the boy I had lifted from the dunes. "You should stop," he said, voice strained. "You're putting your neck in a noose because you think it's justice." I set down my ledger. "I'm putting my neck in a noose because hunger kills quietly," I answered. Sael's hands clenched at his sides. "I never wanted you dragged into this," he whispered. "I wanted you safe." I looked at him for a long moment and realized his idea of safety was obedience. "Safety without dignity is a slower death," I said. He closed his eyes as if the words struck him physically. War arrived the way it always does, first as distant reports, then as shortages, then as bodies. The northern dominion beyond the mountains raided our border towns and demanded tribute in exchange for peace. Corvin argued the realm should send a royal hostage to secure negotiation. His allies suggested Sael, because a weak heir, vanishing into foreign hands, solved multiple problems at once. The opposing faction insisted sending Sael would invite rebellion. Corvin smiled, listened, then announced the decision as if it were fate. Sael would go, escorted by diplomats, to learn humility and prevent bloodshed. Sael did not scream. He simply went pale, then steadied himself with a slow breath that sounded like training. Jory tried to protest and was shoved back by a guard. I stepped forward, hands curled into fists. Corvin's gaze landed on me with cold amusement. "Mistress Vale," he said, "your concern is touching. Remember your place." His tone made my skin crawl because it carried the same certainty as a man locking a door. I begged Sael not to go. I used every argument. His health, my fear, Jory's dependence. The cruelty of foreign courts. Sael listened as if collecting my words, then shook his head once. You saved me, he said softly. I'm not going to let your saving be wasted on a life spent hiding behind curtains. He took my hand with a carefulness that acknowledged my authority and my vulnerability at once. If I stay, he added, Corvin wins without lifting a blade. If I go, at least I can see the Dominion's throat. The day he departed, the palace gates opened onto a crowd that cheered because cheering is easier than thinking. Sael rode in a carriage painted with stars. As the wheels rolled away, he pressed his palm to the window once, a silent promise, and then the road swallowed him. The months that followed taught me what power does when it thinks it has time. Corvin tightened rules, for stability, which meant for control. People disappeared for whispering. Soldiers were paid late. The markets grew mean. Meanwhile, letters arrived from Sael through secret channels, written in a precise hand that did not match the boy who once demanded second bowls of broth. He described the Dominion court, ice blue silk, ritual cruelty, men who smiled while measuring your weaknesses. He also described fractures. The Dominion's nobles distrusted their emperor. Their generals resented empty victories. Sael wrote of learning the Dominion's language by listening at night while servants argued over scraps, and of bargaining for medicine with promises instead of coin. Each letter ended with a short line that pierced me. Tell Jory to study. Tell you I remember the sea. Jory did study. The palace tutor, perhaps out of pity or fascination, taught him letters and law. Jory's mind was quick, but his heart was louder. He began sneaking into archive rooms to copy council records, insisting we needed more evidence against Corvin. I scolded him, then recruited him anyway because survival is a series of compromises you pretend are principles. Together with Senna and Edrin, we built a quiet ledger of Corvin's thefts. Grain diverted, bribes paid, border supplies sold to smugglers. We hid copies in temple tiles and inside hollowed book spines. I slept little. When I did sleep, I dreamed of a boy on the road, and the dream ended differently each time. Sometimes he vanished. Sometimes he turned and accused me. Sometimes he wore a crown of ash. The crisis arrived in a single council session. Corvin announced, calmly, that the Dominion demanded an additional concession. Surrender 3 provinces, or watch the ward executed publicly. Gasps filled the hall. Corvin's voice stayed smooth. We must think of the majority, he said, which is what men say when they want others to carry the moral weight of their cowardice. Edrin stepped forward with documents in hand. Before we trade provinces, he said, we should discuss the funds you have already traded. He laid the evidence on the council table. Corvin's signed orders, the warehouse records, the bribe ledgers. Silence thickened. Corvin's smile did not break. He simply leaned back and said, you brought a clerk to accuse the protector. His gaze slid to me. Mistress Vale, you have a talent for drama. My throat tightened, but I forced my voice steady. I have a talent for counting, I said. You assumed no one would. Corvin reached under the table as if bored. A blade flashed. He lunged toward Edrin, aiming to restart fear with blood. Jory, who stood near the back like a coiled spring, intercepted him. Steel cut Jory's forearm, red blooming. Jory slammed his fist into Corvin's jaw, and the regent stumbled. Guards surged, confusion turning into action. Corvin's arms were twisted behind him. The hall erupted, nobles shouting, scribes scrambling, servants crying. Corvin glared at me through the crush. You think you've won, he hissed. You've only opened the door. His words landed like a curse, because he was right. When you remove a man who held a system together, the system does not vanish. It thrashes. The Dominion executed no one that week. Instead, as if in response to our chaos, they sent a convoy toward the capital under a flag of negotiation. Inside the convoy was Sael, thin but upright, escorted by Dominion soldiers and wearing a ring of iron on his wrist. The Dominion's ambassador stood before our council and announced that Sael had offered himself as guarantor of peace. He had signed a treaty promising annual tribute in exchange for his release. The ambassador delivered the treaty with smug satisfaction. He expected us to accept. Sael's eyes met mine across the hall, and in that glance I saw he was asking permission to do what he had already decided. I stepped forward before the council could speak. We will not pay tribute in the currency of our children, I said. The hall froze. The ambassador's smile faltered. Sael's lips twitched with something like relief and sorrow combined. Negotiation became a performance, and I learned that performance is a battlefield. Edrin argued law. Senators argued risk. Military captains argued pride. The Dominion ambassador argued inevitability. I argued logistics, because logistics are what keep lofty arguments from floating away. I pointed out that tribute would drain our granaries during a flood year, that surrendering provinces would open roads to invasion, that a treaty signed under duress was a rope around our own neck. Sael stood silent while others spoke about him as if he were a parcel. When a duke sneered that Sael was too sick to matter, Sael finally lifted his head. "My heart is weak," he said evenly. "My loyalty is not." The room shifted. People remember strength when it speaks softly. That night, Sael escaped his guards with help from Senna, who distracted them by setting a storeroom fire that did no lasting damage but produced a great deal of smoke and panic. Sael limped into the archive wing where I waited, hands trembling with the urge to hold him. He looked older than the boy I had raised, and his eyes carried the flat exhaustion of a hostage who had counted too many days. "I can't stay," he whispered. "If I stay, the Dominion will return with an army. They only let me come because they think I am leverage." I wanted to shout that he was not leverage. He was a child I had fed and scolded and worried over. Instead, I asked the practical question. "What did you learn?" Sael exhaled. "Where their supply lines break," he said. "And who among them hates their emperor enough to turn?" He did not sound triumphant. He sounded like someone who had traded innocence for information and knew the exchange rate. We planned a counteroffer. Not a surrender, not a tribute, but a trap wrapped in diplomacy. Edrin drafted a proposal to recognize a Dominion claimant who opposed their emperor, offering secret support in exchange for border withdrawal and Sael's release. Senna arranged contacts through merchant caravans. Jory used his new letters to forge convoy schedules. I prepared provisions for a peace summit at the river ford, where Dominion supply wagons had to narrow into a single route. The plan was not heroic. It was ugly, careful, and full of risks that would fall on ordinary soldiers. I hated that. I did it anyway because I had learned that refusing to play does not protect you. It simply ensures someone else plays with your life. The summit day dawned bright and cold. The Dominion ambassador arrived with a guard detail too large for comfort. Our own captain stood tense, hands near hilts. Sael wore a plain coat to look harmless. I stood behind Edrin, holding a ledger like it was a shield. As speeches began, a messenger galloped in with staged panic. A Dominion supply wagon had overturned upstream, blocking the ford, and their troops needed to move around the bank. The ambassador barked orders, and their formation shifted exactly as our map predicted. Hidden archers on our side took position. Dominion horses spooked. In the chaos, a second messenger, our messenger, slipped into the Dominion camp and delivered proof that their emperor planned to poison a rival general. That rival, already primed by Sael's careful whispers over months, turned his troops outward instead of inward. For a breathless hour, the ford became a knot of confusion and betrayal. When it ended, the Dominion ambassador was pinned, his escort disarmed, and Sael's iron ring cracked off his wrist under the blow of a smith's hammer. The realm celebrated, because realms prefer stories with return and triumph. They called Sael the Starward Heir, the boy who outwitted an empire. They held parades. They minted tokens. They forgot the burned border villages that would never be rebuilt. Sael accepted the adoration with a calm that unsettled me. He began attending councils daily, his voice steady, his commands sharp. He approved arrests for Corvin's collaborators. He reorganized the grain system. He ordered audits of every provincial treasury. He also, in private, sat on the annex floor and rubbed his chest when the palace grew too loud, breathing through pain like a man negotiating with his own body. Once, when I offered him tonic, he shook his head. "Not now," he said. "If I depend on medicine to speak, they will use my dependence to silence me." The logic was cruel. It was also correct. The next crisis arrived disguised as romance. The council insisted Sael must marry to secure alliances, to prove continuity, to satisfy the realm's appetite for symbols. They proposed Lady Varys, daughter of a duke whose troops controlled the southern passes. Varys was intelligent, poised, and she looked at Sael with the calm assessment of someone trained to treat marriage as policy. Sael agreed publicly without hesitation. Later he found me in the storerooms and spoke without looking up. "They want a queen they can bargain with," he said. "Varys wants a realm that will not collapse." His tone held no bitterness, only fatigue. I surprised myself by feeling relieved. If Sael married for strategy, no one could accuse me of stealing his attention. The relief tasted like grief. I had not admitted, until that moment, That part of my heart had begun to anchor itself to him in a way that was not maternal and not safe. 2 nights before the wedding, an assassin entered the palace disguised as a minstrel. He carried a dart coated in a toxin that stopped hearts like snapping string. The assassin's target was not Sael, it was Varys. Killing the bride would fracture alliances and restart border chaos. The assassin slipped through the kitchens, past guards bribed by lingering Corvin loyalists, and reached Varys's quarters. I happened to be there, delivering a ledger of wedding provisions, because no one thought an inventory clerk mattered enough to protect. The dart hissed through the air. I moved without thinking. Not brave, not noble, simply faster than my fear. The dart struck my shoulder. Heat tore through my arm. The world narrowed into a single ringing note. Varys shouted for guards. The assassin tried to flee, but Jory, who had been practicing sword drills with captains against my orders, tackled him into a tapestry. They wrestled, grunting, and Jory's earlier wound reopened, staining his sleeve. Guards arrived and dragged the assassin away. Varys pressed cloth to my shoulder, eyes sharp. "You didn't have to," she said. "Yes," I rasped. "I did." The toxin did not stop my heart, but it taught me how close the line was. Old Sable, summoned from Greyhook by ridiculous palace carriage, dug the barb from my flesh and brewed antidote with grim satisfaction. "You always were too stubborn," he muttered, then looked at Sael. "And you," he added. "Stop making the people who love you pay the interest on your crown." Sael's face tightened. He sat beside my bed that night, hands folded, as if he was afraid to touch me and afraid not to. "I built a world where you had to jump in front of poison," he whispered. "That wasn't the plan." I stared at the ceiling beams and tried to breathe through the ache. "Plans are for men who think they control weather," I said. "We control only our choices." He swallowed. "Then let me choose," he said. "Let me choose to keep you close." His voice broke on the last word. It was the first time he sounded like the boy from the dunes. The wedding proceeded anyway, because the realm demanded continuity more than it demanded healing. Varys married Sael with a steady smile and a private glance that held something like respect for me. Perhaps she recognized what I was, an inconvenient witness and a useful ally. Sael placed the ceremonial star circlet on her hair with hands that did not tremble. Priests sang. Lanterns floated on the river like scattered constellations. Afterward, Varys approached me in a quiet corridor. "I know you are not his mistress," she said. "If you were, he would be less careful around you." I almost laughed. She continued, "I also know you are his anchor. A realm needs anchors that are not made of titles. Stay. I won't turn you into a scapegoat." Her honesty startled me more than any threat. "Why help me?" I asked. Varys shrugged, the gesture small and human beneath her crown. "Because I have seen men destroy women to avoid accountability," she said. "Because I refuse to be the kind of queen who needs someone else to suffer in order to feel secure." Years passed in fast, sharp seasons. The Dominion fractured, then rebuilt under a new emperor weaker and more cautious. Our realm strengthened not by miracle but by relentless reforms. Taxation that punished hoarders, military training that valued competence over bloodline, public granaries audited by temple clerks. Jory joined the border scouts and learned the hard truth that bravery is mostly endurance. Senna became head of palace provisions, terrifying corrupt merchants with her smile. Edrin rose to chief judge and turned laws into something that occasionally resembled justice. Sael grew into his crown, and the crown altered him, but it did not erase him entirely. He still asked for my broth when council sessions ran long. He still listened to sea stories when he couldn't sleep. He still, sometimes, pressed his hand to his chest and breathed slowly, negotiating with a heart that did not care about symbols. On the 9th year after I found him, Sael stood on the palace balcony during a winter festival and watched children chase lanterns across the snow. Varys's daughter, Sael's daughter by law, though Varys had carried her with fierce pride, laughed at the way the lantern light turned her breath into gold mist. Sael leaned toward me and spoke so softly the wind almost stole it. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. He did not need to specify what. I thought of Greyhook's dunes, of selling dried fish for medicine, of signing an indenture contract, of poison heat in my shoulder, of Jory's bleeding sleeve, of Corvin's curse. I also thought of the girl laughing in lantern light, of empty bowls that now belonged to a kingdom fed, of the quiet fact that my life was mine and not someone else's bargain. "I regret the wounds," I said honestly. "I don't regret the choice that kept a child alive." Sael's eyes closed for a moment, and when he opened them, They shone with something like peace. Then I can live with the rest, he murmured. That night, long after the festival noise faded, I walked alone to the palace's outer wall where you could smell the river, and on clear nights, imagine the sea beyond it. The stars above Asterhold looked like scattered grain on dark cloth. I thought of Sayle's first demand that I call him Your Grace, and I smiled at the memory because it no longer hurt. A kingdom had tried to turn him into a weapon, and he had become, instead, a person. I had tried to turn myself into a shield, and I had become, instead, a woman with a voice that counted and mattered. Somewhere down the corridor, Varys laughed at something Jory said, and Sayle's daughter shouted that she wanted more dumplings. The sound was ordinary, which meant it was miraculous. I rested my palm on the cold stone and let the winter air fill my lungs. If there was any crown that belonged to me, it was this. The stubborn, unglamorous right to remain, to build, and to refuse to be erased. Corvin's trial did not look like justice in a storybook. It looked like accountants, sworn statements, the slow turning of pages that had once been used to hide crimes. Sael insisted on a public hearing, not because he believed the crowd was wise, but because secrecy was the soil Corvin had cultivated. The regent stood in chains with his jaw still bruised from Jory's punch, and he smiled as if the hall belonged to him. He did not deny the stolen grain. He did not deny the bribes. He admitted everything with an actor's grace, then shifted his aim. All of you, he said, raising his voice, are sacrificing the realm for a boy with a painted star. The word painted struck the crowd like flint. Corvin's eyes met mine. Ask her, he urged. She found him half dead. Convenient, isn't it? A murmur ran through the benches. Sayle's hand tightened on the rail, and I saw the old fear in him, the fear that legitimacy is an agreement that can be revoked. Edrin stepped forward and presented a bundle of cloth sealed with wax. Inside lay the remnants of Sayle's old cloak, the one with the refined stitchwork. The court artisan testified that the weave matched royal quartermasters from a decade ago. Old Sable, dragged into the capital again and furious about it, testified that no ink could survive a fever-sweat breakdown and still appear beneath the skin. Yet Sael's mark had deepened over years. As birthmarks do, Corvin's smile thinned, then sharpened into malice. Marks can be engineered, he said. Blood can be lied about. Sael leaned forward and spoke for the first time in the hearing. You're right, he said evenly. Anything can be forged when men benefit from the forgery. That's why my claim will not rest on a star alone. He lifted his chin toward the crowd. It will rest on what we build now. If I fail, strip the circlet from my line, and let the realm choose again. That promise shocked everyone, because it made monarchy sound like responsibility instead of fate. Corvin had wanted uncertainty. Sael offered accountability. The judge sentenced Corvin to life labor in the border mines, not execution, because Sael understood the way dead tyrants become saints in bad songs. Corvin was dragged away screaming that the realm would beg for his order. The doors closed, and the hall exhaled like a lung released from a fist. The reforms that followed were not romantic. They were arguments over measurements, over who had authority to audit which storehouse, over how many grains of salt should be allocated to a battalion in winter. Sael demanded that the temple clerks publish monthly counts of grain, and the merchants fought back by raising prices, hoping hunger would turn the city against him. Varys convened the southern dukes and threatened to withdraw their trade permits unless they stopped colluding. Senna, ruthless in her quiet way, began visiting warehouses unannounced with a lantern and a list of expected weights. She discovered hidden false floors and forced the owners to repay in public. Jory joined the border scouts, insisting that paper victory meant nothing without muscle behind it. He returned with stories of villages rebuilt from ash, of Dominion raiders who fled when faced with organized patrols rather than scattered farmers. He also returned with a limp and a new scar at his temple, souvenirs from an ambush that could have killed him. When I scolded him, he shrugged with one shoulder and said, "You taught me that some risks are debts you choose." I wanted to hate him for stealing my own logic and using it against my fear, but pride and terror braided together until I could not separate them. I found myself sleeping in the records office more often, head on folded cloth, because the palace had become less a home than a machine we were trying to keep from seizing. In that grind, Sael's presence changed. He stopped acting like a rescued child and started acting like a man who had decided what he owed the world. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions that made ministers uncomfortable, and he did not apologize for their discomfort. The boy who once demanded second bowls of broth had become someone who could sit through a 6-hour debate on irrigation and emerged still thinking about the next decade. In the 6th year of his rule, the Dominion tested us again. Their new emperor sent envoys bearing gifts, fur, carved bone, polite smiles, and a proposal that sounded like friendship. Open our northern ports to Dominion, security inspectors, and receive reduced tariffs in return. Sael invited the envoys to a banquet and served them fish from Greyhook, because he remembered my town and wanted them to taste something they had never conquered. During the banquet, Varys asked the envoys pointed questions about their own granary reserves and the recent unrest in their western provinces. The lead envoy's smile faltered. He had expected a soft court that hid behind speeches. He found, instead, a table where everyone understood supply lines. After the envoys left, Sael called a midnight council. "They are hungry," he said simply. "Hungry men negotiate in order to buy time. Then they take what they can." The room fell silent. War was always waiting, patient as a tide. Sael refused to mobilize in panic. Panic wastes resources. He ordered targeted reinforcements, trained new cavalry units, and authorized Senna to stockpile dried grain in discreet caches along the river routes. I returned to Greyhook for the first time in years to oversee coastal storage, because the sea is a road for both trade and invasion. The town looked smaller than my memory, but the wind felt the same. The stall where I had once stirred broth now held a seamstress shop, and the seamstress recognized me. "You're the one who took that strange boy," she said, eyes wide. "We heard he became someone big." I did not correct her. I bought flour and seaweed and, in a moment of reckless nostalgia, cooked broth in a borrowed pot for children who had never tasted it. As I served bowls, I understood what the palace had never taught me. A realm is not stone walls or documents. It is hands reaching for food, cheeks warming, small lives continuing. When I returned to Asterhold with salted fish and ledger counts, I carried Greyhook's salt on my skin like a reminder of what the crown was supposed to protect. That winter, the Dominion Emperor made his move. Instead of marching an army openly, he sent privateers to harass our shipping and hired mercenaries to stir rebellion in 3 northern towns. The plan was elegant. Choke us without calling it war, then offer relief in exchange for concessions. Sael answered with an unromantic weapon, paperwork backed by steel. He declared the mercenary leaders outlaws, put bounties on their heads, and offered amnesty to towns that turned them in. Then he sent Jory north with a small unit to escort defectors and cut off the mercenaries' food. Jory wrote to me from the road, ink blotched by cold, describing a town where children hid in granary pits and an old woman who insisted on feeding him stew even though her own cupboard was nearly bare. "It feels like Greyhook," he wrote, "only without the sea." His letters were not heroic. They were tired, sharp, full of small details that proved he was paying attention. 2 weeks later, a rider arrived in the capital with news. Jory's unit had been attacked at a bridge, and he had fallen into the river. They pulled him out half-frozen, alive, but his lungs were damaged, and he would be weak for months. I expected Sael to rage, to lash at the council, to make war decisions from grief. Instead, he sat in Jory's sick room and held my brother's hand until Jory's shivering eased. "You are not expendable," Sael told him quietly. "Do not offer yourself like a coin to buy my patience." Jory tried to laugh, failed, and coughed hard enough to cry. In that raw moment, I saw the boy I had carried out of the dunes, and I saw the ruler he had become, someone who understood that saving a realm by spending people is not saving at all. When spring thawed the river roads, Sael led a campaign without declaring one. We called it border stabilization. The Dominion called it provocation. The mercenaries, deprived of food and hunted by their own fearful hosts, began selling each other for amnesty. A Dominion ship that harassed our coast was intercepted by Greyhook fishermen, who had been trained by the Navy in exchange for tax relief. They captured the captain and marched him to the nearest magistrate like he was a common thief. The Dominion Emperor, embarrassed, demanded the captain back. Sael refused, citing maritime law, and offered instead to exchange the captain for a shipment of seized grain belonging to our border towns. It was a strange negotiation. One life for thousands of meals. The Emperor